Hey there, environmental science students. It's Mr. Johnson here with set 3 of our bird identification. We'll be going through 6 birds in this video. I'll remind you that you should have written down your first impressions. And as I go through this, write down the key features that I point out to you. And don't forget afterwards to add notes as to how you will remember this bird, keeping in mind that you will be tested using different pictures. So let's get started. To start off with, we're going to be learning the white-breasted nuthatch. The white-breasted nuthatch, there are actually 2 nuthatches that we're going to learn. One is the white-breasted, and the next one you'll see just after this slide. Both nuthatches, one of the things we can use to identify them is their behavior. If you look at this bird, you can notice that it's pointing down the tree. So it's actually facing down the tree, and its head is kind of, pointed out away from the tree. But this is kind of an interesting behavior that nuthatches do, and really no other bird does, at least in this area. Woodpeckers will sometimes kind of be upside down for just a minute if they're on kind of a weird branch, but this white-breasted nuthatch and the other one, the red-breasted nuthatch, both very often are facing down. So to look at this nuthatch, you can see that it's kind of gray. It's got a white breast and belly, and if you weren't careful, you'd think that this is maybe a black-capped chickadee. But you'll notice here that it doesn't have any of that black on its chin, and it does have a longer beak. This bird eats insects in trees. It'll also eat some seeds too, but it's looking for insects in the bark of the trees. And so this beak will help it kind of pluck those insects out. I'll come back to the white-breasted nuthatch here in just a minute for another key identifying feature of this bird. But before we do, let's play a video, or I guess the song of this bird. The song is really telling. It kind of sounds like someone has plugged his nose and is laughing. So let's listen to that. Again, you can kind of hear that nasally laughing sound. When it's not making that sound, it'll sort of make a nasally sounding honking sound. So that's something that a lot of times that I'll hear that call before I see this bird. I'll remind you that we can identify birds by sight, sound, and behavior. And if I can get kind of 2 of the 3, sight, sound, and behavior, then it's pretty helpful in making sure that I'm right on whatever bird I'm identifying. So if I hear that kind of nasally laughter sound, then I'll be looking for that white-breasted nuthatch. Moving on to the red-breasted nuthatch. If you take a minute, you can kind of see some similar features. This picture on the left, you see it's still facing down the tree like the white-breasted nuthatch is. This red-breasted nuthatch, if you look at it, it's a little more colorful. It gets its name obviously from the red kind of rusty color breast and belly of the bird. It does kind of have almost a bluish gray back, unlike the white-breasted nuthatch. And the big giveaway with this, can you see it, is the eye band. That eye band that goes all the way through the eye and into the beak. Let's go back through and look at the white-breasted nuthatch. There, again, gray bird, white breast and belly, maybe a hint of coloration below, but not much. And then it's got that white face. Compare that to the red-breasted nuthatch. A lot more color. That red is very obvious, and that black band is through the eye. So if I see a nuthatch, if I see something facing down the tree, I will immediately know. Again, they hang on to the trunk of the tree facing down that tree. If I see that behavior, then I'll look at the face immediately to see if it has that band through the eye or not. In this area, the more common one that you're going to see is the white-breasted nuthatch. I've only seen the red-breasted nuthatch in this part of the state a few times. It's a lot more common out kind of in the western part of the state. This bird also is a lot smaller. So if you see a small, pretty colorful bird facing down the tree with an eye band, it's that red-breasted nuthatch. Let's move on to the brown creeper. The brown creeper, if we take a look at this, it has some characteristics that we've seen before. It has these stiff tail feathers to help it prop up against a tree, and it has kind of a long pointy beak. So it shows the characteristics very similar to a woodpecker, but it's not a woodpecker. that long pointy beak is actually curved a little bit to allow it to get into the crevices of tree bark a lot easier. And this stiff tail feathers, it does prop the bird up on the tree so that it can actually be kind of counter that pecking and prying that the bird is going to do. Now this bird gets its this bird gets its name from the way it sort of creeps up around the trunk of a tree. So with this bird, I usually can't see it really well. And the reason I can't see it very well is kind of shown in this picture. It blends in really, really well. And so this bird, if it stays stationary, it blends in and looks just like bark. But I can tell if there's a little bird that looks, and he's little, if I see a little bird and he blends in really well to the tree, then I'll look for the behavior too. If we were to pretend like if this branch were a tree trunk, obviously that would change proportions a little bit. But the bird would sort of meander back and forth and kind of around the back and kind of come back, and it would sort of creep up that trunk of the tree until it gets to the first few branches, and then it'll fly down and go and do the same thing at the next tree. It doesn't go up very high into the branches. Once it's kind of gone, into the lower ones, it'll fly off and go to the neighboring tree. So the behavior of this bird is going to be very helpful in me identifying it. It tends to stay by itself. It tends to blend in really well, but it's certainly something that you can see if you pay attention and watch for it. Now, let's get to the European starling. This is one of several birds that people will just kind of look at, and they'll notice the overall color, and they'll just say, oh, look, it's a blackbird. Well, we do have blackbirds, but it usually is, it's a name given to, in addition to other parts of a name. So, for example, we will learn the red-winged blackbird. That is a blackbird, but it just has red wings. The European starling is named off of where it came from. So the European starling is one of several birds that was brought over from Europe simply, because people wanted it here to remind them of home. And I've also heard that people brought them over because they were in literature that was brought with them. And so they had mentioned maybe the European starling in some of that literature, and they wanted to be reminded of home. Is kind of what I've heard is the reason that they were brought over. But anyway, European starlings are very common. They look like they're blackbirds until you get a better look at them. We can actually see a pretty bright yellow beak and orange feet. Now, this can be different in appearance, brighter or duller, depending on the age of the bird and the season that we're talking. But then what we see here is we see really a lot of patterning in the bird. So yes, it does look black from a distance. It's a little bit smaller than a robin, but if we look closely, we can actually see kind of some shimmery, some iridescence to it, and we see some spotting. That's a little more obvious when you get a little closer to it. I've seen a lot of these birds lately. They must have just migrated back in, and you'll see them all over. You'll see them on bird feeders. You'll see them up high in trees, down in lawns. You'll see them in big groups. You'll see them by themselves. The European starling is pretty widespread and common bird. Let's compare that to another really common bird that people call a blackbird. This is a common grackle. The common grackle is quite a bit bigger than the European starling. Remember, the European starling was smaller than a robin. The common grackle, it's smaller than a robin by a little bit. The common grackle is quite a bit larger than the robin, but not nearly as large as the next bird we're going to go over. If you look at this bird, it's largely kind of that black color. I'll point out this longer tail. It's kind of a long, sort of scooped tail. The two things that you'll see on this bird, aside from it just being generally a black color, would be this kind of shimmery, iridescent head. So it's sort of got this shiny, kind of oily blue looking head with a prominent kind of light colored eye. Now, if you look just for the eye, that might be helpful, but where does your eye get drawn first? Well, it's to this iridescent blue head. My mom has had a lot of these go to her bird feeder lately, and so she'll always say, oh, it's like a really big black bird with kind of a really pretty blue head. And so even with that simple description, that tells me that she is seeing a lot of these common grackles. Again, this is a pretty common bird that you'll see, throughout your neighborhoods and on lawns, and they pretty much they're all over the place. Moving on to the American crow. The American crow can get huge. Our first impressions of it, if you said it's jet black from the beak to the feet and tail, you are right. This whole bird, everything, is just a flat black color. This is one of those birds that can be really big. It can get to be the size of a reasonable sized cat even. These are the birds that you'll see scavenging things like dead rabbits or squirrels in the road. And they have a lot of effort to get flying when they're that big, but they'll usually fly away before you get too close to them in a car. These are your typical birds that people think of when they think of a blackbird, but it's not. It's a crow. It's really common. I always associate the call with spring and fall, particularly kind of during the Halloween season, because it does kind of have a Halloween sounding call. Here's the call that you'll hear. I think this is the most common. So those two calls are really common. I hear them a lot when there's not a lot of leaves on the trees, and I'll hear it they'll be in big flocks when they're migrating in or out. And I think that's a call that people are pretty familiar with. That'll be the end of this particular video. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for the next.